All right, guys, welcome to the JPS podcast, the first episode with the one and only Mr. Eric Helms. So, for those of you who don't know who Eric is, you obviously have been living under a rock since the early 2000s. But Eric has been in the game since 2004, I believe. Eric?
Yeah, I've been lifting since then. I think I didn't really have much of an online presence until 2000, I don't know, 7, 8, or 9, somewhere in there. So, yeah.
And Eric is a natural pro bodybuilder, powerlifter, published author, has a Bachelor of Science in Fitness and Wellness and a Master's in Exercise Science and Sports Nutrition. And you're currently studying a PhD in Strength and Conditioning in New Zealand. So he's a bit of a genius and you're a bit of an all-round good guy. I'd like to preface the interview with the fact that Eric and the 3DMJ crew have been mentors of mine since eight or so years ago when I first started in the game. And I've learned a lot from Eric, just his podcasts, YouTube videos, muscle and strength pyramids. And with all that knowledge, I've then applied that to JPS and obviously have passed that on to our 15 coaches. And we work with quite a large number of people here in Australia, and we do up to 600 sessions a week. And I'm very thankful for Eric's work, and I'd just like to ask you first and foremost, Eric, did you ever predict that the magnitude of the impact you could have had on the lifting community?
No, I would say that. I didn't predict it, but I did plan for it to some degree. Things have been going according to plan, which is a rare occurrence in life.
I don't take you as someone who would just hope for the best, throw a stone and hope for the best.
Well, I would say that I plan and then I hope for the best. But it wasn't just like I was like, yeah, let's see what happens. Like I definitely. Interesting, unique story. You mentioned my bachelor's in fitness and wellness. For my final year of that course, I had I can't remember the exact name of the course, but it was basically a fitness business or fitness marketing class. And I wrote basically the business plan and the marketing strategy for 3DMJ before 3DMJ started.
Oh, wow.
And that was part of my pitch to Alberto and Brad and Jeff when we first got the thing going. So
that's pretty cool. So you actually planned it from the start. And when did you write that plan? What year was that?
Early 2009.
And 3DMJ kicked off, was it the following year?
It actually started at the end of 2009. Berto and I were both full steam ahead because we had been friends since 2007. He was already coaching people, and he thought I would be a good he had a lot of respect for me, and even though I was really just some snot-nosed kid who didn't have a pro card and was working on my bachelor's degree, that kind of thing. But I think he respected me for all the reasons that he does. But anyway, so then we approached Jeff, and then later in that year, maybe early 2010, I can't remember the exact timeline, Brad, who were older bodybuilders, more experienced, and had been in the game a long time, and we thought that our enthusiasm, knowledge, and vision would be complemented very well with their pragmatism, experience, and maturity, and it was. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting how the three of you have such, I guess, different backgrounds and how it is complementary to each of your, skill set and knowledge base. But where did you guys, as you started 3DMJ, where did you see that going? Did you think that they would ever get to a point where it was a worldwide, coaching service that it is today?
I wanted it to get there. I remember our meetings in 2010, and I was working nearly full-time as a personal trainer. Berto was working as a part of the I want to say Bay Area Unified School District as an after-care provider, after-school care provider. Jeff was receiving more or less a pension or a separation package after an auto plant closed down that he was working in. And Brad owned a gym and also did some moonlighting as a CAT scan tech or a imaging tech. I don't want to get which device wrong. So all of us had full-time jobs in addition to 3DMJ. And I remember Brad specifically, I think at the end of 2009, he was like, we made $4,000 this year. Like, and it was exciting, because it was something that we did almost as a hobby on the side. And that we went to every single show, and we would spend late nights over at Jeff's house working on the website over the YOLO platform, just old school stuff, and really doing a lot of work with minimal payoff and only getting a small following to kind of start rolling. And it wasn't until 2011 that we started to realize that this could become our primary income, and that was right around that point. 2011, probably end of 2011, I want to say, is when the first of us started to make it work completely. Sam's second job. It was definitely a struggle. I know that there was a point where I had to work full time or almost full time as a teacher in a private personal trainer institute while coaching full time while prepping, all to save enough money to get to New Zealand. There's a time period where I think Jeff actually had to declare bankruptcy before then getting the full time and selling his old home and now getting to the financial position he's at now. Hopefully he didn't mind just putting him on blast there. But the point is that there was definitely a low point for the business and for each of us financially where we weren't really sure how it was going to make it, to then now being, I would say, one of the more respected online coaching services in the realm of bodybuilding and strength athlete that exists.
Yeah, definitely. I obviously the fitness industry is quite a fickle industry, and there is no financial stability, especially as you mentioned when you're transitioning from a more stable income into what is the unknown, so to speak, of personal training, online coaching, all the rest of it. But was there ever a time that you guys, hit a brick wall or, failed, so to speak, where you really started to question whether or not it'd be worth it?
I would say no. I think all of that was at the start as to what the feasibility was. And we were fortunate enough at the start that we loved it so much. If it had just stayed as this kind of side gig we did and stayed more as the original model of being like this online magazine for natural bodybuilders and a place to give exposure, because it all grew out of Jeff Albert's blog. 3D Muscle Journey was his return to the sport with a healthier mindset blog, and it basically just became a group blog. And then we would go to shows and cover the shows, and then when we finally decided to break it coaching, we decided we'd sponsor 2 athletes for free, so we were coaching them for free. So I knew in the back of my head, and all of our heads to some degree, we thought this would become a career, but we were in no rush, and we weren't discouraged because we weren't in a rush. We didn't have unrealistic expectations. And then when it started to take off, that's where we actually had problems. There was a point where we kind of blew up in 2011, and we decided to have a waiting list, and that was a mistake because within 8 months we had a waiting list of something like 300 people.
Yeah, I think I was on that waiting list.
Apparently, most people were at some point. And that was when we decided to start our Skype consultation program as a way of trying to find a way to provide some sort of service to these people, but also acknowledging the fact that we can't give week-to-week coaching to everyone without drastically sacrificing our mission statement. We could have given cookie cutters to everyone and destroyed our own name 3 years later as being shitty coaches.
It's a fine line, isn't it? You there? I think you there, Eric? Hello?
Yeah, you cut out just for a second. I'm not sure, but
all good.
All good. Can you hear me?
I can. So obviously, in the lifting community, we know that you're very intelligent. You're pretty strong. You've got your pro card. But what would you say is your biggest weakness, if you had any? Oh, and you're very handsome as well.
Maybe if you tell me more things that are my strengths, and then I'll come up with a weakness. So just go for 5 minutes.
Well, I thought those were weaknesses.
So I would say probably my biggest weakness is that I take things personally too easily. I think the internet is a place where you need to have a certain degree of thick skin. And I take things personally for other people too. Like if someone says something about someone I care about, or says something that I know is untrue and it's a mischaracterization, I have a tough time letting that go. So I have to limit my online exposure to some degree, control the way what I follow, what I don't, what platforms I use to degree, just to sort of keep myself sane and positive, more importantly. So I'd say that's probably my biggest weakness. Someone like Alberto Nunez is very, very self-grounded to the point where he only values the opinions of people who he has a deep connection with, who know him. And I, for some reason, get bothered by people who don't know me acting as though they do, and then especially if they have a perception of me that doesn't align with who I think I am. Right.
Yeah.
So
interesting, and I guess that'd be something you almost couldn't prepare for, from an emotional intelligence standpoint, as obviously technology has evolved as well as your business. That's something that you've really had to learn along the way. So that's really interesting. But one of my other questions I had for you was, we know that the anabolic window, so to speak, has been closed thanks to research by Aragon and the rest of the gang. And we know that in the lifting community, we overemphasize things. Is there anything that you think, the natural bodybuilding community, powerlifting community is placing too much emphasis on at the moment? Without any, premise, so to speak.
Yeah, this is something that out and often occurs, and we place emphases on different things. I think the anabolic window is a useful one because it shows how we went from it's all important to now it doesn't matter, it's closed. And I think I would say the window is broad, and the window doesn't let in a lot of air. Like if the goal is to use the window to cool the home, it still does something. And I think what the magnitude of importance is just something that is a little that was miscued before, and I think that's actually a common flaw. If I'm going to talk bigger picture, you may not accept this as a good answer, but I think the thing that we get wrong the most is that we're still seem to be in search of a silver bullet at all times, and when something is proven not to be a silver bullet, then it is just bad. So we tend to have this natural dichotomous thinking about different fitness trends, which is, I think, in and of itself the biggest issue. And we have trouble putting them into context and understanding which situations they're important. But anyway, to more directly answer your question, what is something right now that we're probably putting too much emphasis on? I would say training frequency. And not that training frequency isn't important. In fact, it's been a huge key to success for a lot of people for moving from, say, intermediate to advanced. And I can say that for myself and a lot of my athletes.
Well, everyone's gone from, the bro split 5-10 years ago to trying to squat every day. Like it's been pretty interesting to watch the shift in frequency. Can you tell us more about why that's occurred?
Yeah, for sure. I think for one, the science, quote unquote, would suggest that volume is very important for hypertrophy. However, how you distribute that volume is also quite important. And there have been a slew of studies and a meta-analysis now, systematic review as well, that have suggested that for both hypertrophy and strength, trying to get all your volume on each movement or body part only once per week, even with matched volume, to something with a higher frequency and lower volume per session is inferior. And it probably makes more sense to start splitting up your volume over more sessions as you get a full day of recovery between. You get meals between. Each individual session becomes shorter, so there's less fatigue in the latter part, so you can preserve quality. But at the same time, even in the evidence-based community, a lot of people are pushing that to the nth degree and thinking that basically the mindset of more frequency is better. When I think a better way of looking at frequency is that it is a useful construct to split up your volume. And we know that probably at least more than once per week of training each body part is optimal. After that, it gets much murkier, you know, and like even the famous quote unquote volume, or what is it, the Norwegian frequency study, where they had the powerlifters who were training each lift 3 times a week, went to 6 times a week, and they got huge. People forget this is actually not a peer-reviewed published journal article. It was an abstract at a conference. Not to say that the data isn't correct, but it's just very limited data. And I saw another recent abstract where they took much less trained individuals, still trained individuals, do the exact same thing, and there wasn't any difference between the 3 and the 6 week group. And I've also seen studies on untrained individuals where, you know, doubling their frequency and maintaining their volume didn't result in any kind of increase in strength or hypertrophy. And I think the take home here is, well, okay, then why? Why is it seeming to be more effective in certain populations and not others? And if you look at some of the studies on, say, like 2-a-days versus 1-a-days, or going to a 3-day per week body part split from a 1, like Brad Schoenfeld's study, they're all done on pretty moderately well-trained individuals. So if you think about it in terms of, if the stress you experience is a combination of the volume and intensity, you have to do a certain amount of stress for you to be required, or not required, for you to benefit from spreading it out over multiple days. Like, if you're only going to do 5 sets of bench per week, do you really need to do 5 days of bench where you only, you know, do 1 set per day? Probably not, you know. I think because of data that's not appropriate for us to use to make a conclusion, like for the example that more advanced lifters have a shorter peak in NPS in response to training, people have gone, okay, therefore I need to train every day. And that's a big leap based on a small data point, in my opinion. What about the joint recovery? What about the psychological side of things, of getting burned out from trying to train every day?
Central nervous system, you know, all the rest of it,
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are going on in recovering in our body besides simply the deposition of proteins into our muscles, right? That are affected by training. How long does the, you know, when you train, there's a decline in force production before it comes back, right? So do you want to be training that same movement in a very frequent time period? Or maybe you need to, or maybe you can, but it just needs to be a purposely lower intensity session. So I think high frequency can have a very important role in programming if you use it kind of like a valve for volume. And you probably want to start with what we know is at least the bottom rung of optimal of training each body part or movement at least twice per week, depending on where you focus on strength or hypertrophy. But I do think we need to get out of the mindset of more frequency equals good, and without any kind of caveat or context.
That's extremely interesting, that you can give it some context and some common sense. You spoke of evidence-based community. Now, obviously, we know that evidence-based means applying research with experience to the client's needs or your individual needs, which I think to a large part is why a lot of the literature, you know, doesn't necessarily work in theory, because there's so many different individuals responding in so many different ways. But if you had to prioritize one for personal trainers or coaches or athletes, forget people, you know, such as yourself who are doing a master's, people in the trenches actually are trying to apply the research, what do you give the greatest priority to out of the 3 factors in evidence-based, you know, because everyone claims they're evidence-based, you know?
I think it's very important for people to understand a hierarchy of evidence. You know, this is something I went over in one of my videos where within the scientific community, you'll typically see the pyramid, and the most important thing is the meta-analysis. I just love pyramids. Look, man, all right? I'm part of the Illuminati. Just deal with it. So yeah, at the most important portion of the pyramid, where we should place the most emphasis or weight on, would be the meta-analysis, which is the study of studies, which is a common problem in the fitness industry, or rather fitness research, exercise science, and nutrition both, is they're very underpowered. So like if you see a study with 4 or 5 people in it, and even if they say, oh, P equals less than 0.05, which basically means supposedly that these findings are could have only happened due to chance with a 5% chance or less. So you think that's pretty strong veracity. What you don't realize is that when you have such a low sample size, the potential for that being an error in and of itself is pretty high. So a meta-analysis is a way of sidestepping that. Is once you have enough studies, you can pull them all together, and essentially every participant in all those studies becomes your total N. So I like to make my primary decisions based off of multiple meta-analyses. Those are my rock solid feelings. Like I know volumes related to hypertrophy. I know higher intensity is going to make you stronger. I know protein intake in the off season is probably going to not be more helpful after 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kg kind of thing. Those are the big nuggets. After that, then comes the RCTs, the well-done studies, which are a part of those meta-analyses. After that comes more like your case control studies and your case studies themselves, where there may or may not be a control group, or it's just looking at associations within a single person. So I think that's all good and dandy if you're someone who research and who has regular access to it and is reading research and interpreting it. But if you're someone who is, let's say, just a trainer, just an athlete who wants to try to get a good understanding of this information and apply it, you will often need some kind of medium, which is why people like me exist, or your Alan Aragons or your Brett Contrerases or your whoever, people who basically do the best they can to take the totality of the evidence, interpret it, and put it into practice for others. And I think for that, then the person needs to understand, the person being the consumer, how to identify someone who follows the scientific principles, right? How do you identify someone who tries to take their own biases out of it, whose primary purpose is not just to sell you something, and who isn't selling something sexy? They're selling, basically information, and I'm actually I've written a pretty good article that's going to come out pretty soon about the philosophy and the attitude behind someone who is doing that. And you should basically see someone who is not speaking in superlatives, so not claiming that something is a gift from God or is the silver bullet, because that truly does not exist. That is a marketing strategy. And you want to be looking for someone who does not immediately attack alternative ideas. And that's not to be confused with someone who goes after pseudoscience. Like if someone's going after, Food Babe because she just came out and said, hey, everyone should do, the juice cleanse diet, and you realize that it's a micronutrient deficient diet you don't want your mother to do, me making a Facebook post about that, it's not necessarily the same as someone saying, hey, I heard time under tension is really important, and you going, you're an idiot, look at the study. That's not a true scientific attitude. That's basically an ad hominem attack. That condescending attitude is a subtle version of a personal attack, which is used to discourage dissent and discourage discussion, which is wholly unscientific in my opinion. So you want to see someone who treats others with respect in terms of when there's intellectual discussions and disagreement, and you want to see someone who prizes being objective over all else as part of their ethos. And then ideally someone who has some level of experience with the research and application. You don't want a pure scientist. They're great for what they do, but a pure scientist who's never been a trainer or has never been an athlete is going to have a little bit of trouble interpreting and translating it. Likewise, a pure athlete who's never been in science, he might know what works, but he might not know why it works or how to better tweak it. So I think ideally you want someone who is a blend of those two backgrounds.
And do you think that with the whole, evidence-based movement and, focus on, scientific, evidence being applied to personal training, do you think we're getting any closer to bridging that gap? Or do you think that we're getting further and further away from, the exercise scientists and the dietitians and the, physiotherapists who have all the science? They get anatomy, they get it all. And then the personal trainers who are, quite unqualified, so to speak, to then apply, what little they know to their clients.
Do
you think we're getting closer?
I tend to be a bit of an optimist, and I see what I create. Because my job is to try to bridge that gap. I obviously am seeing the connections, so I don't know how objective I can be about that globally. But I do think it's getting better, because the things that exist now did not exist when I was coming up as a personal trainer. There was no Alan Aragon's research review. There wasn't like Omar Issa's YouTube channel, which was with 500,000 people watching, or almost 600,000 now, who just want evidence-based information. But yeah, I mean, now these days are a bunch of different research reviews that you can subscribe to. I think where the gap might be is that you have to be someone who knows that is something that you need to pursue.
Yeah, awareness.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of personal trainers, and they may just you have to have some level of understanding that is something you should even be going after, which is not a given. So there needs to be something inherent in the way that we educate personal trainers that makes continuing education of a certain type very important, rather than just filling out the questionnaires and there's easy ways to stay as a personal trainer and not be informed, unfortunately. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I know that for those who are aware that they need to seek out that information, there's way more resources now than there used to be.
Yeah, that's a good answer. One of my questions I had for you, Eric, was saw in one of your YouTube videos or podcasts that you were dabbling with some weightlifting. My question to you is two-part. Why did you start?
That was short, by the way.
And why did you stop?
Good question. So I started because it's awesome. I think weightlifting. I remember I went to a powerlifting meet back with Berto in 2008 or 9, and there was a group of guys from a weightlifting club who came to do the powerlifting meet kind of in their off season just to build some strength, and they all had rock bottom high bar squats, which stood out, but they were still pretty strong for their size. No bench to speak of. And they didn't know what it was like to max out on deadlifts. They all pulled conventional with relatively low hips, and you could tell that they were used to like doing clean pulls. Yeah. But it was still pretty cool because these are guys who can, do things that our bodies can't even get into position on. An overhead squat or, rock bottom snatch or clean. So it was always something I was fascinated with. I always had a lot of respect for it, and I just never really had the opportunity to learn it. And when I knew that I was going to be going to New Zealand, where I am now, to study strength conditioning in a more broader sense, outside of just being basically a bodybuilding and powerlifting specialist, I wanted to get a little bit more of a broader education, understand sports science and strength conditioning as a whole. And I thought, I should be pretty familiar with the Olympic lifts. So in 2011, before I left, or I guess 2012 and 11, right kind of at the end and the beginning, I started getting some Olympic weightlifting coaching from a local guy named Chip Conrad at Body Tribe in Sacramento. And then I did the USA Weightlifting Level 1 certification at California Strength back in 2012, relatively popular gym. And then when I arrived in New Zealand, I pretty quickly contacted a guy named Adam Story, who is the head coach of Weightlifting New Zealand, or he's been selected a couple times to go to the Olympics. Really good guy, and happened to be in the same building where my AUT campus was, where you have basically it's kind of like AIS, if you will. Yep. Like it's the High Performance Sport New Zealand and our university are all there doing research together. So anyway, I trained and still train at North Sport Olympic Weightlifting. Did Olympic weightlifting for a little over a year before my hips started playing up. And it was the combination of high volume, high frequency Olympic weightlifting to a very low depth, low hip angle, along with very heavy low bar squatting, where I started to get my hips playing up, and I got diagnosed with what's called FAI, or femoral acetabular impingement, which is essentially, if this is, for those who can actually see this, if this is your hip socket, your acetabulum, this is the femur, this is the neck of your femur, going very, very, very deep, if you don't have the right shape of hips genetically, and having that at a high velocity or heavy load, you get bone-on-bone contact, and eventually I tore my labrum on my left side. And as those who remember Wolff's Law from anatomy and physiology, when bone gets contacted or gets force driven through it, more bone forms along those lines. So basically, a spur generates on both the lip of the acetabulum and the neck of the femurs, so that your range of motion gets further shortened the more you do it. So I wasn't quite sure what was going on at first, but eventually I realized it. Got imaging done, got diagnosed with FAI.
Did you have surgery?
And I just say again.
Did you have surgery? It's very common for people with FAI to have labral repair and stuff.
I am scheduled to have surgery in just less than a month, actually.
Yeah, that'll.
So,
it's quite a. What's the recovery process for that?
I've got one of the best surgeons is located for this type of surgery here in New Zealand. Again, in the same sporting facility. It's kind of like the mecca of New Zealand sport. So Matt Brick, and he's going to be doing my surgery in end of February. Typically, what happens is it's about 6 weeks where you can only do like cycling and mobility drills. Like that's probably even too aggressive a word to describe what it is, but like standing leg circles and things like that. I can train upper body, and then after the 6 week mark, I could start doing limited range of motion, limited load, lower body movements. I will probably be doing things like EMS, like electrical muscle stimulation, and potentially blood flow restriction as early as I can. But obviously, some of the quad and hamstring muscles cross the hip, so that I have to be careful there. But it's going to be bilateral, not totally open me up, but kind of orthoscopic. They go in, they retract my bone, patch up the labrum on the left side, and then within about 4 months, most people are fully recovered and close to where they were before. I've seen a lot of pretty amazing recoveries. Tracy Lambrix is a New Zealand lifter who just went to the Olympics in 2016. She got the surgery, I want to say, a year or two prior to that.
That's impressive.
Yeah. So it's definitely not a life sentence to be never able to squat again. In fact, I'm really looking forward to it because it means I'll be able to low bar squat again. I probably will do it very low in volume at the start and really ease back into it and be intelligent. But it may mean I could get back into Olympic weightlifting, although I wasn't very good anyway. So we'll see. I'm just happy to be able to squat again. Front squat.
Well, one of my questions on that was, in terms of you having to stop Olympic weightlifting, what did you learn from that? And was there anything that, you could then carry over to powerlifting, bodybuilding, from the lessons that you learned in a different discipline?
Yeah, that's funny. This actually goes back to the frequency conversation because the traditional lore in bodybuilding and powerlifting is that frequency is kind of capped at twice per week per exercise. If you think about the most common Western world programs, like there may be the upper lower splits, like fat. Was high frequency. Lane arms, upper lower basically, or upper lower and then body parts that everything got hit twice, and then west side with your twice a week squatting, or twice a week squat or deadlift, and twice a week benching that's about as high frequency as it got. But the culture is a similar but different culture in Olympic weightlifting, where the same rules don't exist, and it's just what people have always been doing. And because Olympic weightlifting is not just exercises, but highly difficult, skill-based exercises that take years to master, people have always just done it more frequently. And
practice the skill.
Exactly. So, like the average amount, like once you get past the beginner stage, and if you take someone who has the time, average number of sessions per week is like 6 to 10 for a weightlifter. And you're snatching and clean and jerking, and probably 3/4 of those, and then maybe half you're squatting, and then doing clean pull and block from jerks, and snatch pulls and variations, drop snatches, all the same lifts all the time.
And on that, Eric, sorry to interrupt. Because you're doing such high frequency, what percentage, of 1 rep max are you lifting at for the most part?
Yeah. That's another important thing to remember is that these are all velocity-dependent movements. So when they complete it, it doesn't look like it was failure like you would on a squat. You don't grind through it. It still has to be completed at adequate velocity for you to get underneath it, stand up with it. So I'll put it into terms that powerlifters and bodybuilders will understand. The most someone will probably clean and jerk would be, say, 2/3 of their deadlift, maybe, if they're really, really good, and snatch might be like 60% of their back squat.
So you're using lighter weights as a result of the difficulty of the movements. Yeah.
Correct. Okay. Yeah, and then the lifts themselves, like if you take I'm sorry, say again?
I don't have extensive knowledge in Olympic weightlifting, but they are concentric only movements, correct?
Right, yeah, there's very little eccentric component.
Less muscle
Your
damage.
weight's dropping around if you go near the gym. They dump it off at the top. Yep. Which means that there's less muscle damage and wear and tear from training. So you're seeing a lot of singles, doubles, and sometimes triples at loads that they will almost always get. And most of the misses you'll see in general training is just because they didn't do it right and they got out of position, which is a very common occurrence. And you'll see, depending on the style, there's some who follow a slightly more Bulgarian approach. The intensity is typically follows a linear trend throughout the year towards competition, but there's not huge long blocks where you're going for max snatches and max clean and jerks on a regular basis. So, like any intelligent approach, if the frequency is going to be high, then you have to moderate the intensity and or volume.
That's very interesting. And it sort of brings me to my next question regarding dual athletes. I guess that makes you a triathlete.
For a while. For a while, yeah.
So obviously 3DMJ work with a lot of dual athletes who transition between powerlifting and bodybuilding. My question to you, Eric, is how do you guys use both sports to the advantage of one or another? And do you or the athlete, prioritize or get to choose which one they want to focus on more? And how do you work that into their long-term plan?
Well, it's always the athlete's choice. If I was to characterize our model of coaching, it would be like autonomous supported, which is actually, if you want to look that up, it's a thing. But basically, they are in the driver's seat. It's an interesting relationship. Mike Tuchscherer actually conceptualizes very well. If you understand how sports teams are owned and managed, he says that the athlete has an interesting role. They're both the athlete and the owner, while their coach is like the general manager.
Yeah.
Because the athlete can fire you, right? Yet they also are supposed to do what you're saying. So it is an interesting relationship when you're coaching an individual sport, when you're not part of some program like we are. We have our own businesses, and people come to us and they say, "I want to work with you," and they can say whether you're not doing what they want. Likewise, you can also say, "You're not doing what I want. I want to fire you." And I would say, probably more often than we get fired, we fire our clients in our experience. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just mean when two people don't click, there's expectations aren't being met, et cetera, et cetera. But so the athlete is in charge of what they want to do, and they tell us their goals. Now, often that doesn't necessarily mean that their actions always match up with what they say their goals are. So there are a lot of conversations where they go, "Oh, hey, Timmy, you told me that you really, really wanted to be a bodybuilder, and I noticed that this season, you've been really keeping your weight low in this off season so that you can stay in the 83 kilo class. That's only 4 kilos over stage weight. I understand you like being strong and you're doing pretty well, but I do think this is going to have a negative impact on your bodybuilding career. Are you more focused on powerlifting now or bodybuilding?" And they often go, "Damn it, coach, you're right. I want to have my cake and eat it too." And so there can be conflicts, and it's just important to have a strong mission statement to begin with. And then it is the coach's job to help them be accountable to that and to help them think about the times when maybe they're subverting their long-term goals with their short-term desires.
Yeah.
Which is not uncommon at all.
That's really interesting how you manage both powerlifters and bodybuilders, and that leads me to my next question. So we know that strength and size are very similar physical qualities in a very broad sense, but from a purely scientific standpoint, training for one means that there's a trade-off for the other, due to specificity. Do you think that when dual athletes focus on, say powerlifting over, higher volume phases in their off season, that it can conflict with their overarching goal of being a bodybuilder? And obviously, conversely, do you think the powerlifters who do bodybuilding in their, so to speak, off seasons could be counterintuitive because they may not be practicing the skill of the big three enough for, at higher intensities? What are your thoughts on that?
I would like to think we are specialists in doing this in such a way where you are trading off minimally and getting a net total benefit. So scientifically, what it comes down to is that volume is the thing that's closest associated with hypertrophy. Not that more volume is always better, but the thing that should be behind your progressive overload over your career should be volume. Sometimes people will get confused and be like, "Oh, I didn't do more volume than last week," and I'm like, "That's just because you're doing a linear periodization. That doesn't matter." But next year, hopefully, you're doing a little bit more volume. Yeah. So that means if you are a bodybuilder competing in powerlifting in your off season, you still need to be doing an appropriate amount of volume for your training age. Mm-hmm. However, you just want to make sure that some of it comes from the squat, bench, and the deadlift, which you work into your program. Yeah. So to give you kind of different categories of thinking, if you're a bodybuilder who's like, hey, I'm going to compete in powerlifting, A, it's fun, B, it keeps me focused in the off season, and C, having a weight class limit that is perfect so that I have a little bit of accountability for how heavy I let myself get. Those are all the pros. Great. I'm going to train like a bodybuilder. However, I'm just going to include the big three in my exercise selection. And those specific exercises will be done a little bit heavier, closer to a meet to help me peak.
And it's
it gets much harder when you are a true dual athlete, though.
Yeah. And it's still that long-term thinking with, so long as volume's going up year to year, I'm a bodybuilder, per se. Yeah. More
or less, yeah. So long as you're, of course, you got accessory movements in there. The way a bodybuilder who trains for power, or the way a bodybuilder who competes in powerlifting trains,
they still do diet raises.
Right, exactly. It's going to look different than your pure powerlifter who is like, why would I do a calf raise? That kind of. So.
I watched your recent interview with Ian McCarthy, which I thought was really well done. And you spoke about flexible dieting for bodybuilders being the path less walked. But is there ever a point when you're coaching someone and you need to get a specific result in a specific time frame that you simply default to, dieting heuristics and what is easier, just letting them eat clean purely so that they can get on stage? And do you give up fighting that good fight, so to speak?
Yeah, I think a good way to look at it is the amount of flexibility that needs to be introduced is very much directed by the athlete. Like, if they are totally fine and have the habit of eating mostly quote-unquote clean foods, that's fine. It's only an issue when that mindset causes them problems, like if they have to travel, or if they are outside of their environment, or if I find out their food list is such a small list of items that they're actually probably micronutrient deficient somewhere. Yeah. That's the only time I really try to encourage someone to be more flexible. Or if that behavior leads them towards struggling when the diet is over, because they don't follow that, which lets you know that maybe they actually are having cravings despite saying like, oh no, I just enjoy broccoli and chicken.
Yeah, so the two things that you're considering are health and then adherence. Are they the two underlying? Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And sometimes it'll be on the very end of the other end of the spectrum where someone is incredibly flexible and they're working on all kinds of things, and it's always highly palatable foods, always a high variety. As they get deeper into prep, their prep time in the kitchen is going higher and higher and higher.
Yeah.
And I start to encourage them to start eating lower palatable foods, more single-item food ingredients, taking less time in the kitchen, and trying not to feed the food preoccupation that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
So that the diet becomes less of a mental stress, and they're feeling a little more satiated, at least acutely.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. The two contrasting, athletes that you have to deal with. But we know that IFYM, and learning how to track food, calories, macros is an investment, and we know that it takes time. There's like a large learning curve that occurs when we have to, start learning what's in our food and the composition of our food. And that obviously humans are terrible with delayed gratification. But how do you, as a coach, get people to, prioritize this at the expense of short-term gains? Like, how do you deal with that? Because that's a problem that, we as coaches, especially with the general population, struggle with. It's very difficult to get them to, buy into the process from the onset.
Sure, and it's got to be customized to the individual. I think the biggest shortfall of if it fits your macros is most people will they'll supply it to everybody. Like, here, all you need to do is hit these three numbers and you'll be sweet. When you talking to someone who doesn't know the difference between protein and carbohydrate, like they actually do not know what the macronutrients are, how to track them, and they've never looked at the back of a food label. So with someone like that, you need to simply start with having them eating exactly the same way they have been, and just putting pen to paper or fingers to keys and just tracking what they eat and start becoming aware of the calorie, protein, carbon, fat amounts in foods without actually trying to modify anything. And then spending time just on the educational side so they know what the basic function